"Tell them you are my wife," Albert had said. And everyone in the grand lobby was left completely speechless. Penelope Adams had only been hoping to finish her shift and return home that day, but those unexpected words pulled the ground right out from under her feet. She was meticulously mopping the polished marble floor of the main lobby at the Emperor Hotel in downtown Chicago when she heard a shrill, piercing voice echoing from the reception desk. It was mid-afternoon, on an unusually hot Thursday in September, and the luxurious hotel was bustling with important guests, business executives, and wealthy tourists. Penelope had been working there as a housekeeper for 3 long years. At 31 years old, she knew every single corner of that historic building, every stubborn stain that required extra effort, and every potential complaint from the most demanding guests who frequented the establishment. "Does this place just let anyone wander in here?" shouted a woman, adorned in an extravagantly expensive designer dress and massive dark sunglasses that hid half her face. "Is this a 5-star hotel or a homeless shelter?" Penelope slowly lifted her gaze from the soapy water and saw that the furious woman was pointing a sharp manicured finger directly at her. Penelope's simple blue uniform was slightly damp from the water in her cleaning bucket, and her hair was tied back in a messy bun. She instantly felt a burning sensation rush to her cheeks, a deep flush of embarrassment and shame. "Madam, she works here," explained Mary, the front desk receptionist, maintaining a voice that was firm but exceptionally polite, trying to de-escalate the rising tension in the elegant lobby. "Works here." The wealthy woman let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the high gilded ceilings. "Then, why on earth is she so filthy, parading around the main lobby as if she were a paying guest? This class of people should be strictly confined to the rear service entrances. I do not want to look at maids when I am paying such an exorbitant amount of money to stay at this prestigious property." Penelope gripped the wooden handle of her mop so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. It was certainly not the first time someone had treated her with such disdain, but it had never happened so loudly and in front of such a large crowd. Several affluent guests had stopped in their tracks to watch the unfolding scene, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and harsh judgment. Penelope desperately wished she could simply melt into the marble floor and become entirely invisible. It was precisely at that agonizing moment that a deep, calm, and authoritative voice shattered the tense silence of the lobby. "She is not a maid." A tall, imposing man wearing an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, suddenly appeared right beside Penelope. He appeared to be about 41 years old, possessing a remarkably serious face, but his eyes held a surprising warmth and kindness. Penelope recognized him in a heartbeat. It was Albert Crawford, the wealthy and powerful owner of the entire hotel. She only ever saw him occasionally striding through the upper hallways, always deeply engrossed in business, always distant and untouchable. They had never exchanged anything more than a brief, polite passing greeting. The arrogant woman severely furrowed her brow, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. "What do you mean she is not a maid? Look at her. She is literally wearing a uniform and holding a mop." Albert briefly turned his head and looked at Penelope for a fleeting second, his eyes silently asking for permission she did not quite understand. Then he smoothly turned back to face the irate woman standing exceptionally tall and declared with an unwavering, commanding voice, "She is my wife." The entire grand lobby of the Emperor Hotel instantly fell into a dead, stunning silence. Penelope felt her legs turning to jelly, trembling so violently she thought she might collapse right there beside her yellow bucket. "Wife." She opened her mouth to speak to correct this insane misunderstanding, but Albert smoothly continued speaking without even glancing in her direction. "My wife simply enjoys helping the dedicated staff out from time to time. It is a personal passion of hers to stay grounded. And quite frankly, madam, the horrific way in which you treat hard-working people makes me seriously doubt whether this hotel is the appropriate place for you to be staying." The wealthy woman's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. She opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water, desperately searching for a retort, but finding absolutely none. Finally, completely defeated and humiliated by the owner himself, she snatched her expensive leather handbag and stormed off toward the golden elevators, her high heels clicking furiously against the marble. Albert slowly turned back to face Penelope. His eyes were serious now, but there was a deeply hidden emotion swimming within them that she simply could not decipher. "I am so sorry about that," he said, in a very low voice meant only for her ears. "I had to make her stop treating you that way." "Are you all right?" Penelope could barely process the surreal event that had just transpired. She gave a small, slow nod of her head, still entirely mute from the overwhelming shock. "Good," he said softly. And just before he turned to walk away, he leaned in slightly and added in a hushed, urgent whisper, "Tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon, come directly to my private office on the 10th floor. We need to have a serious conversation." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Penelope standing completely frozen in the very center of the opulent lobby, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, and her mind absolutely overflowing with 1,000 unanswered questions. That entire night, Penelope could barely manage to catch a single wink of sleep. She tossed and turned in her small, cramped bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. When the next day finally arrived, she nervously rode the employee elevator all the way up to the prestigious 10th floor of the hotel, her palms sweating profusely. She had never once set foot in the executive suites, let alone Albert Crawford's personal office. She walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway until she reached a heavy, dark oak door that bore a shining brass plaque with his name engraved upon it. She took a deep, shaky breath and knocked twice. "Come in," called his deep voice from the other side. The office was expansive and breathtakingly beautiful, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning panoramic view of the Chicago River and the towering skyline. The walls were lined with tall bookshelves filled with heavy volumes, a large mahogany desk sat in the center, and framed historical photographs of the hotel decorated the remaining space. Albert was seated behind the imposing desk, but the moment he saw her enter, he immediately stood up. "Penelope, please take a seat," he said, gesturing politely toward a plush leather chair situated opposite him. She sat down, her posture rigid and tense. Albert slowly sank back into his own chair and let out a long, heavy sigh. "First and foremost, I want to deeply and sincerely apologize again for what happened yesterday in the lobby. I absolutely did not plan that. It was a completely irrational impulse." "You really did not have to do that," Penelope finally said, managing to find her voice in the quiet room. "But thank you. Honestly, no one has ever stood up for me or defended me like that in my entire life." Albert nodded slowly, his expression growing somber. "That woman was entirely out of line, and I refuse to allow anyone to be humiliated in my hotel." But he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "We now have a bit of a problem on our hands." Penelope furrowed her brow in confusion. "A problem?" "The news spread like wildfire," Albert explained, leaning forward. "Several guests were talking about it with the concierge staff. Half of my employees are curious and gossiping. And early this morning, I received a very urgent phone call from my family. They heard a rumor that I had secretly gotten married." Penelope's eyes widened. "But you can just tell them the truth. You can explain it was a misunderstanding to defend an employee." "I could," he admitted softly. "But the truth right now is complicated." He looked out the large window for a moment before turning back to her. "My mother is extremely ill. She is 68 years old and suffers from a very weak, failing heart. For many months now, She has been relentlessly begging me to settle down to get married, just so she can see that I am happy and taken care of before she—" He stopped, swallowing hard, fighting back a wave of emotion. "Before she passes away. She is deeply anguished at the thought of leaving this world and leaving me entirely alone." Penelope instantly felt a tight, painful knot form in the center of her chest. She intimately knew that exact kind of profound, agonizing grief. She had lost her own beloved mother just 2 years ago to a prolonged illness. "I understand," she said, in a quiet, empathetic whisper. "But what exactly do you want from me?" Albert took a deep, steadying breath. "I know that what I am about to ask you sounds like absolute madness, but I desperately need you to at least consider it. I would like to formally ask you to pretend to be my wife for a few months, just until my mother finds her peace, or until—" He did not finish the dark sentence, but Penelope understood perfectly. "You want me to lie to your dying mother?" she asked, her voice laced with pure disbelief. "It would not exactly be a malicious lie," Albert said quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. "It would be giving her one final beautiful moment of profound happiness and peace of mind. You would not need to know all the complex details of my life. And I would compensate you very generously, of course. I would pay you a substantial monthly allowance, and I would help you financially with absolutely anything you might need." Penelope fell completely silent, her mind racing. It was pure insanity. How on earth was she supposed to successfully pretend to be the wealthy wife of a powerful man she barely even knew? But then she thought about her own difficult, exhausting life. She lived entirely alone in a tiny rundown apartment on the south side, far away from the glamorous city center. She worked incredibly hard scrubbing floors until her back ached, but her meager salary barely covered her basic living expenses. Worst of all, she carried a massive crippling medical debt from the extended time her late mother had spent in the intensive care unit. "How much time are we talking about?" she asked cautiously. "1 month, perhaps? 6 months, at the absolute maximum," Albert replied honestly. "Her primary doctor told us just yesterday that she really does not have much time left. I just want her to experience genuine peace before she has to go." Penelope carefully studied the handsome man sitting across from her. There was a raw, undeniable sincerity in his dark eyes, heavily mixed with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "I am going to need to think about this," she finally said, standing up from the leather chair. "Thank you," Albert said, a massive wave of relief washing over his face. "That is truly all I ask." Penelope practically floated out of the lavish office, her head spinning dizzily. When she finally arrived back at her tiny apartment that evening, she sat at her small rickety kitchen table for hours, drinking cheap tea and thinking about everything. It would certainly be morally questionable to deceive an old woman, perhaps, but it would also be an act of profound, comforting kindness for a grieving mother who was actively dying. The next morning, as soon as her shift began, she marched right back up to Albert's office. "I accept your proposal," she declared firmly. "But I have one strict condition. When all of this is finally over, I want you to completely pay off my outstanding hospital debt. Absolutely nothing more. I do not want your monthly allowance or a life of luxury. Just the debt." Albert immediately extended his large, warm hand across the desk. "It is a deal." They firmly shook hands, and in that exact fleeting moment, completely without knowing it, they were boldly taking the very first step towards something that would permanently alter the course of both their lives forever. Exactly 2 weeks later, Penelope found herself standing nervously in front of a massive, breathtakingly beautiful historic mansion situated in the incredibly wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago. Albert stood right beside her, gently holding her trembling hand in a way that felt surprisingly natural. "Just breathe," he murmured in a low, comforting voice. "Everything is going to turn out just fine. My mother is a truly wonderful, gentle person. My younger brother, Well, he can be a bit complicated and difficult, but please do not worry about him. I will handle him." Penelope was wearing a simple but elegant floral dress that Albert had insisted on purchasing for her from a high-end boutique on the Magnificent Mile. She still felt out of place and strange enveloped in all this sudden luxury. Over the past 2 weeks, they had secretly met multiple times after her cleaning shifts to carefully rehearse their fabricated love story. Albert had shared intimate stories about his privileged but stressful life, about his complex family dynamics, and about how he and his younger brother Ryan had jointly inherited the massive hotel empire from their late father. In return, Penelope also opened up about her own difficult life. She spoke of how she had grown up in a rough neighborhood, how she had barely managed to finish high school, and how she had been forced to start working grueling jobs from a very young age just to help her struggling family survive. The heavy front door of the mansion slowly swung open, and an elderly woman with pure white hair and the sweetest, most welcoming smile appeared. She was seated in a sophisticated wheelchair, being gently pushed forward by a professional private nurse. "Albert." "My sweet boy," she exclaimed brightly, throwing her fragile arms wide open. Albert immediately let go of Penelope's hand and dropped down to one knee beside his mother, wrapping his arms around her with immense tender care. "Hello, Mom. How are you feeling today?" "Much, much better now that you have finally arrived," she said softly. And then her warm, tired eyes slowly shifted to focus directly on Penelope. "And this beautiful young woman must be—" "Mom, this is Penelope," Albert said gracefully, standing back up and gently pulling Penelope closer to his side. "My wife." Albert's mother, Eleanor, instantly brought both her trembling hands up to rest against her chest. Her kind eyes rapidly filled with bright, happy tears. "Oh my goodness. My dearest son, you really did it. You actually got married. I honestly did not believe it when the staff first told me the rumors." "You better believe it," Mom Albert said, flashing a bright, seemingly genuine smile. "We got married exactly 2 weeks ago. It was a very simple, fast ceremony, but it is real." Penelope suddenly felt the crushing, suffocating weight of the massive lie they were telling. But when Eleanor reached her frail hand out toward her, Penelope instinctively took it with genuine, heartfelt affection. "Come closer, my sweet girl," Eleanor said softly. "Let me get a really good look at you." Penelope stepped forward and gently knelt down right beside the wheelchair, just as Albert had done. Eleanor reached out and gently touched Penelope's flushed cheek with her trembling warm fingers. "You are absolutely gorgeous, and you have such kind, deeply compassionate eyes. My wonderful son chose very, very well." "Thank you so much, ma'am," Penelope replied, feeling a thick, emotional knot rapidly forming in the back of her throat. "Please call me Eleanor," the older woman said, beaming brightly. "We are officially family now." They slowly made their way into the sprawling, luxurious house, and Penelope was introduced to several more people. There were a few wealthy aunts, distant cousins, and finally Ryan Albert's younger brother. Ryan was 35 years old, undeniably handsome, and carried himself with an incredibly confident, almost arrogant swagger. But his sharp, calculating eyes were completely ice-cold when they finally locked onto Penelope. "So you must be the famous, mysterious new wife," Ryan said, stepping forward and aggressively shaking her hand with significantly more force than was strictly necessary. "What an absolute shock. My dear brother never even once mentioned your existence before this week." "Everything happened incredibly fast," Albert interjected smoothly, firmly placing his protective arm around Penelope's delicate shoulders. "When you finally manage to find the right person, there is simply no reason to wait around." "Right, of course," Ryan replied slowly, but his sarcastic tone was distinctly unfriendly, heavily laden with dark, brewing suspicion. The tension in the grand foyer was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Albert smoothly guided Penelope away toward the lavish dining room, before Ryan could ask any more probing questions. During the extravagant multi-course dinner, Eleanor simply could not stop asking endless excited questions. Where exactly did the two of you first meet? How beautiful was the private wedding ceremony? Were they truly happy together? Penelope and Albert smoothly answered every single question by sticking strictly to the detailed fabricated history they had carefully agreed upon during their secret meetings. They claimed that they had initially crossed paths in the quiet library of the hotel, that they had slowly fallen in love over countless late-night conversations, and that the impromptu wedding had taken place quietly at the downtown civil registry office. Just the two of them, and exactly two legally required witnesses. I just truly wish I could have been there to see it, Eleanor said gently, wiping away a stray tear of joy with a linen napkin. But the only thing that truly matters is that you are finally together and happy. Later that evening, when everyone had comfortably relocated to the spacious, warmly lit living room, Ryan aggressively pulled Albert aside into the dark, quiet hallway. Penelope anxiously watched them, speaking in low, harsh, hushed voices, their faces tense and angry. She could not hear the exact words being exchanged, but her gut instinct told her that Ryan strongly suspected they were hiding something. When the two brothers finally returned to the main living room, Ryan loudly cleared his throat and announced to the entire room, "Mom, I was just thinking that we absolutely must throw a massive, lavish party to properly celebrate the sudden wedding of Albert and Penelope. What do you think about that?" Eleanor immediately clapped her fragile hands together in pure delight. What a truly fantastic idea. Ryan, yes, we absolutely must celebrate this beautiful union properly. Albert slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Penelope, and she instantly saw a heavy wave of dread and panic swirling in his dark eyes. A massive public party meant significantly more complex lies, more people to fool, and an exhausting amount of continuous acting. But what else could they possibly do without breaking Eleanor's fragile heart? It will be an absolute pleasure, Albert finally said, forcing a bright, convincing smile onto his face for his mother's sake. When they finally managed to leave the imposing mansion late that night, Penelope was physically and emotionally exhausted. Inside the sleek, quiet car, Albert drove through the glowing Chicago streets in total silence for a long time, until he finally spoke. "My brother strongly suspects something is terribly wrong. He has always been exactly like this. He constantly needs to control every single aspect of everyone's lives." "And what exactly happens now?" Penelope asked, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "Now we simply have to be significantly more convincing," Albert replied grimly. "I am so deeply sorry about all of this, Penelope. I know this is an incredible burden for you to bear." Penelope continued looking out the window, watching the rain begin to lightly streak the glass. "Your mother is a truly extraordinary woman. I completely understand why you are willing to do all of this for her." Albert glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and offered a sad, grateful smile. "Thank you, Penelope. Truly." And right in that quiet, rainy moment inside the moving car, something tiny, but undeniably real, began to shift between the two of them. The grand celebration took place exactly 3 weeks later inside the most lavish, elegant ballroom of the Emperor Hotel itself. Penelope was a bundle of terrifying nerves. She was wearing a breathtaking floor-length navy blue silk gown that Albert had insisted on buying for her, and a professional stylist had arranged her hair into a sophisticated updo. When she had looked at her reflection in the tall mirror before leaving her tiny apartment, she honestly almost did not recognize the elegant woman staring back at her. Albert had come to pick her up personally in his luxury car. When she finally opened her apartment door, he just stood there frozen on the threshold for a long moment, simply staring at her in awe. "You look beautiful," he finally said softly, and there was something so sincere in his rich voice that it caused Penelope to blush, a deep shade of red. "Thank you," she murmured softly, suddenly feeling very shy. Inside the massive, glittering ballroom, there were more than 50 important people in attendance. Wealthy family members, powerful business associates of Albert, and several high-ranking executive employees of the Grand Hotel. To add to the complexity, Albert had also invited Clara, the strict but kind-hearted head of the housekeeping department, and Thomas Albert's closest lifelong friend and personal corporate lawyer. Clara looked utterly bewildered to see her best cleaner dressed like royalty, but she offered Penelope a warm, supportive wink from across the room. Thomas simply smiled knowingly, helping to keep the wealthy guests entertained. Penelope felt incredibly small and vulnerable, surrounded by so much wealth and power, but Albert never once left her side for even a single minute. He held her hand warmly, confidently, introduced her to everyone, laughed heartily at the guests' jokes, and constantly made sure she felt completely safe and included. Eleanor was comfortably seated in a specially cushioned chair, right in the very center of the magnificent ballroom, smiling brightly and happily greeting everyone who approached her. She excitedly called Penelope over to her side several times throughout the long evening, just to lovingly hold her hand and loudly proclaim how happy she was. "You have truly brought the bright shining light back into my dear son's eyes," Eleanor said affectionately at one point. He had been completely lost and consumed by his work for so many years, but now he is finally smiling again. Penelope honestly did not know what to say in response. Every single aspect of this was a massive, elaborate lie, but the radiant, pure happiness shining in Eleanor's eyes was undeniably real. Right in the middle of the lively party, while Albert was distracted speaking with a large group of wealthy real estate investors, Ryan stealthily approached Penelope. "May I please speak with you privately for just a moment?" Ryan asked smoothly, flashing a sharp smile that completely failed to reach his cold eyes. "Of course," Penelope said politely, even though every single instinct in her body instantly went on high alert. They slowly walked away from the loud music, retreating to a much quieter, dimly lit corner of the massive ballroom. Ryan aggressively crossed his arms over his chest. "I am going to be entirely direct with you, Penelope. I absolutely do not believe in this ridiculous sudden marriage for a single second." Penelope felt her heart rapidly accelerate, but she fought desperately to keep her facial expression completely blank and calm. "I honestly have no idea what you are talking about, Ryan. I know exactly what I am talking about." Ryan continued, stepping uncomfortably close. "I did my own digging. You work here. You are literally a cleaning woman in this very hotel. My brother never mentioned you to anyone. And then suddenly, magically, the two of you are secretly married. It makes absolutely zero logical sense." "Sometimes beautiful things happen very rapidly," Penelope responded smoothly, desperately, trying to keep her voice perfectly steady. "Or sometimes desperate people simply lie," Ryan shot back, leaning in even closer. "I do not know exactly what sinister little plot you and my brother are currently hatching, but I promise you, I am going to discover the truth. And the very moment I do, I am going to expose you and tell my mother absolutely everything." Penelope felt a terrifying, icy shiver violently run straight down her spine. "Would you really do something so cruel?" she whispered fiercely. "Would you intentionally hurt your own dying mother just to prove a point? I would be protecting her from a massive, disgusting lie," Ryan countered sharply. "And I would be protecting my wealthy brother from a blatant, money-hungry opportunist." Right before Penelope could open her mouth to defend herself, Albert suddenly appeared right beside her, his presence large and instantly commanding. "Is there any sort of problem happening over here?" Albert demanded, his dark eyes snapping back and forth between Penelope and his brother. "Absolutely none," Ryan said smoothly, putting on a fake smile. "I was merely taking the opportunity to get to know my lovely new sister-in-law a little bit better." Ryan then quickly turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Albert and Penelope standing entirely alone in the shadows. "What exactly did he just say to you?" Albert asked, his voice thick with worry and anger. "He heavily suspects absolutely everything," Penelope whispered, fearfully looking around to ensure no one was listening. "And he directly threatened to tell your mother the truth." Albert tightly closed his eyes for a long moment, as if he were desperately trying to gather his inner strength. "I am absolutely not going to let him do that. I will go and have a very serious talk with him right now." "Would it not be significantly better to simply tell her the honest truth right now?" Penelope suggested softly. "Before this massive web of lies gets completely out of hand and ends up hurting her even more." Albert looked deeply into Penelope's eyes. Then he slowly turned his head to look at Eleanor, who was currently laughing joyously with a small group of old friends. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Please, Penelope. Just give me a little bit more time. Look at her. She is so happy." Penelope slowly nodded her head, even though she could vividly feel the heavy, crushing weight of terrible guilt rapidly expanding in her chest. The remainder of the lavish celebration passed by like a blurry, surreal dream. When the party finally ended and Penelope returned to her tiny, quiet apartment, she sat heavily on the edge of her bed and thought deeply about absolutely everything. She had originally accepted this bizarre arrangement purely for the financial help to clear her mother's crushing medical debt, but now she was deeply entangled in something significantly more complex. She was genuinely starting to care deeply for Eleanor, and even more terrifyingly, she was rapidly starting to care for Albert. Over the course of the following several weeks, they began spending significantly more time together outside of the hotel. Albert frequently took her out to expensive dinners in the city, just to maintain the elaborate illusion that they were a deeply in love married couple, just in case anyone from his social circle happened to see them. But during those supposed fake dates, they found themselves talking for hours about very real, deeply personal things. Albert openly shared how he had tragically lost his father when he was only 28 years old, and how he had been forced to abruptly take over the massive hotel corporation entirely on his own. He confessed how incredibly lonely he felt at the top, even though he was constantly surrounded by thousands of people, and how he had completely given up on ever finding someone to genuinely love. Penelope, in turn, told him all about her deeply held dreams of eventually attending nursing school, about how much she genuinely loved taking care of sick people, and about how she profoundly missed her late mother every single day of her life. And slowly, imperceptibly, something incredibly powerful between them began to shift. The physical touches that were originally meant to be pure acting suddenly started to feel shockingly real and electric. The bright smiles they shared were entirely genuine, and whenever Albert looked at her across a candlelit table, Penelope felt a massive fluttering sensation in her chest that genuinely terrified her. She was undeniably falling in love with him, and deep down she strongly suspected that he was falling in love with her too. Exactly 2 full months had smoothly passed since they first struck their bizarre deal. It was a freezing, bitterly cold morning in late November when Albert suddenly called Penelope on her cell phone, and just by the sheer panic in his trembling voice, she instantly knew that something was terribly, horribly wrong. "It is my mother," he said, his voice completely breaking with raw grief. "She took a massive turn for the worse late last night. The medical doctors are saying it is now only a matter of days." Penelope instantly felt hot, heavy tears burning the back of her eyes. "I am leaving my apartment right now. I am coming straight there." She arrived at the grand mansion in the Gold Coast exactly half an hour later. Albert was sitting silently in the massive living room, his face incredibly pale and exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from crying. The moment he saw her walk through the door, he immediately stood up and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. This was absolutely not a part of their elaborate acting routine. This was a very real, incredibly vulnerable hug from a broken man who desperately needed profound comfort. "She is currently sleeping," he whispered into her hair, "but she explicitly asked to see you the very moment she wakes up." Penelope stayed right there by his side for hours, holding his hand tightly. Ryan was also present in the house, pacing anxiously, but the usual animosity in his eyes was replaced by sheer sorrow. The tension in the house was incredibly thick and heavy. A few agonizing hours later, Dr. Harris, the private physician, gently stepped out of the bedroom and quietly informed them that Eleanor had finally woken up and specifically wanted to see both Albert and Penelope. They walked up the grand staircase together, their hands tightly interlocked. Eleanor was lying weakly in the massive, luxurious bed, looking incredibly pale and physically fragile. But she still possessed that same beautiful, comforting smile. "My sweet, precious children," she whispered with a very faint, breathy voice. "Please come sit here, beside me." They immediately sat down on the edge of the mattress, each of them gently taking hold of one of her frail, cold hands. "I want to sincerely thank the two of you," Eleanor said, struggling slightly to catch her breath. "These last few beautiful months have honestly been the absolute happiest moments of my entire life. To finally see my wonderful son so happy, to see him fiercely loving, and being deeply loved by someone so incredibly special. It was absolutely everything I ever prayed to God for." Penelope felt the hot, salty tears rapidly streaming down her face. She simply could not hold them back any longer. "Eleanor, we need to tell you." Penelope started, her voice violently shaking with overwhelming guilt. "I know, my sweet girl," Eleanor interrupted softly, giving Penelope's hand a weak but firm squeeze. "I have always known." Albert went completely white as a sheet. "Mom, what do you mean?" Eleanor offered a tired, knowing smile. "Did you honestly think I would not realize it? A mother knows her own child. Albert, I knew perfectly well that you two were putting on a desperate act for my sake in the very beginning." Penelope completely covered her weeping face, with her hands sobbing uncontrollably. Albert was trapped in a state of pure, absolute shock. "Mom, I am so deeply sorry. I just desperately wanted you to be happy. I did not want you to constantly worry about me being alone. I know exactly why you did it, my sweet boy," Eleanor said gently, reaching out to stroke his tear-stained cheek. "And it was incredibly beautiful. It was honestly the most profoundly generous, selfless thing anyone has ever done for me. But do you want to know what else I clearly saw?" She slowly shifted her warm, tired gaze from Albert to Penelope. "You both definitely started out faking it, but you entirely stopped faking it many weeks ago. The tender way you two naturally look at each other now, that is absolutely not a lie. That is deep, profound, genuine love." Albert and Penelope slowly turned their heads and looked directly into each other's eyes. It was undeniably true. At some completely unknown point during their elaborate charade, the fake acting had miraculously transformed into something incredibly real and powerful. "I honestly do not even know how it happened," Albert whispered softly, never breaking eye contact with Penelope. "But it did happen. I fell deeply, completely in love with you, for real." Penelope felt as though her heart was going to literally explode out of her chest. "I love you too," she whispered back, crying openly. "I tried so incredibly hard not to fall in love with you, but I simply could not stop it." Penelope promised Eleanor that she would always take care of Albert, and Eleanor passed away peacefully, knowing her son had found true love. 3 days later, at Eleanor's funeral, Albert and Penelope stood together, not out of obligation, but genuine devotion. Ryan sincerely apologized after learning the truth from his mother, admitting he had wrongly judged Penelope and recognizing that their love had become real. After the funeral, Albert told Penelope they no longer needed to pretend, and asked if she wanted to build a real relationship with him. She happily agreed, and they shared their first genuine kiss, marking the beginning of a new life together. 6 months later, Penelope was thriving in nursing school with Albert's loving support, while also serving as the head coordinator of guest care and employee wellness at the Emperor Hotel. The couple happily shared a cozy home and looked forward to their future together. Albert realized that wearing a temporary mask had unexpectedly led him to discover his true self and the love he had always needed. While Penelope believed that a fresh start comes from choosing a new path rather than returning to the past, their journey showed that true love often grows from grief, uncertainty, and unexpected circumstances, teaching that vulnerability is a strength. Genuine happiness comes from embracing authenticity, and the greatest blessings often appear when we least expect them.